Hey, and welcome to another episode of the Marco Podcast.
This show was created to shine a light on the realness of being an entrepreneur. Why organization is not a one-size-fits-all, why you need to give yourself grace, and so much more. The Marco Podcast aims to provide motivation, inspiration, or encouragement for you to keep going after your dreams. I'm your host, Angel. Sit back and prepare for valuable tips, resources, laughs, and so much more. If this is your first time here, welcome, and thanks for joining. If you've been hanging around for a while, welcome back, and I hope you brought a friend. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 100th episode of the Modco Podcast. Yes, you heard that right. This is episode number 100, and I am super excited. Thank you all so much for hanging out with me each week. I am glad that you all are here, and I really appreciate you all. I'm going to do things a little bit differently today. Since I started podcasting back in April of 2023, I've received a lot of questions about podcasting and what all goes into it and why do I do it, just different things like that. So I thought that it would be fun to answer those questions on this episode. So that's what we're going to do today. The first question that I have is, how do you get organized for your podcast? I do that in a couple of ways. So for episodes where I'm recording with a guest, I have a checklist that I created. Y'all know I love a good list. So the checklist has steps on it, and the steps are broken in. I shouldn't say steps. Obviously, it has steps. It's a checklist, right? What's a checklist without steps? The checklist has different categories on it. And I have broken the categories down into pre-scheduling, interview prep, post-interviewing, editing, show notes, after show production, and promos. This just helps me to ensure that I take all the necessary steps for each guest in episode so that my episodes are consistent, because before I was using the checklist, I was all over the place with my guest episodes. Sometimes I couldn't remember if I scheduled a promo for it or if I added in the right opening or closing for it. There were times that I forgot to update my calendar link. So it was a lot. I was a newbie with it. I didn't quite know how to organize myself, but after a while, I kind of figured out some things and started getting organized. And so the checklist has been very, very beneficial to me. And I also have a planning calendar that I use to keep track of my episodes. You all may have heard me talk about it before, but it's just one of those calendars that it only gives you the month. There's no extra lines or anything like that. It's just literally a 12-month calendar. And each week I write down what the episode is going to be and what episode number it is. And sometimes I change it, but usually it's what I put down is usually what it is, but I always write in pencil in case I need to change it. But that helps me to stay on track with it. And I also have a podcast notebook, and the notebook allows me to go into great details about what we talked about on the episode, who was the guest, and then I'll make notes on there, such as if I included a promo or if there was anything special that I did that I may not normally do. Then I also put on there as well, it's on my checklist, but I put in the notebook too, whether or not I have emailed the person with all of the links. For my solo episodes, I usually keep some episodes like just in, I guess, kind of like a backlog or on the back burner for whenever I feel like throwing it in there. And also sometimes with my solo episodes, I will get a random idea for an episode and I'll just go and record it. I have several episodes that I've either written out or that I've recorded that just haven't aired yet because I just don't feel like it's the time to air them. So that's how I stay organized for my podcast. The next question that I get a good bit is, how long does it take you to record an episode? Honestly, just depends. If I'm recording with a guest, we will usually record anywhere between 20 minutes to 50 minutes. Of course, stuff gets edited, but that's usually the time frame for guests. I think I've only gone to 50 minutes with a guest maybe 2 or 3 times. Usually it's more around the 40-45 minute mark, but I have hit that 50-minute mark a couple of times. It just honestly depends on how the conversation is flowing. For solo episodes, usually about 15 to 20 minutes when I'm recording. Some have been as short as 10, but I try to go to at least 15, but then once I edit, it usually ends up sometimes getting knocked down to 11 or 12 minutes. And okay, so question number 3, where do you host your podcast? So, right now, while I'm recording this episode, I currently host my podcast on Spotify, but I am looking to transition to a new hosting site. I'm playing around with that. I chose Spotify when I started my podcasting because when I did the research, it was free and it was the recommended hosting site for newbie podcasters. And I needed free because I didn't have any funds for the podcast. So I did that and it was great. It has helped me a lot. It wasn't as much of a learning curve as I thought it would be. Once I kind of got in there and played around with it, I was pretty good to go. But yeah, as of right now, it is hosted on Spotify. Question 4. How did you come up with the name of your show? So I suck at coming up with names for things, y'all. To this day, I'm not quite sure how I was so easily came up with the name for my child and my dog. Well, my child, obviously I had help with that one. The dog, yeah, I'm not sure how it just came so easily and popped in my mind and I was fine with them and not like, oh, I should have changed those. But when it comes to naming anything else, it's not my forte. It's not really my thing. So the name of the podcast is just a shortened version of my business name, The Modest Company, because I didn't want to spend days or weeks trying to come up with the perfect name and end up hating it later or being like, ooh, should I have done that? So I just decided to go with the Modco podcast. And maybe one day I'll change it. Maybe one day I won't. I have actually played around with the idea of changing it, but then I have to rebrand and do a whole bunch of other stuff. And, it gets to that whole, formerly known as the Modco podcast. And now I just feel like it's too much. So we're probably just going to rock with the Modco podcast. Question 5, and this is a question that I get a lot. How do you find guests? And I find guests in several different ways. One of the ways that I find guests is from the podcasting groups that I'm in on Facebook. I'm in several podcasting groups. I couldn't even tell you how many. Some I've left, some I've just recently joined. But in the groups, all the groups are pretty consistent with using the hashtag of find a guest or be a guest. If there's a certain topic that I'm looking for example, recently, maybe a couple months ago, I put out a call for guests and I had 5 or 6 different topics that I was looking for people to talk about. And so that's what I listed in there was those topics. I only wanted people to talk about those topics. So I'll create a call and I'll create a call. I'll create a post and I'll put out a call for guests. If I'm just looking and I'll let them know like what the topics are and this is what I want to talk about. If it's just me wanting to talk about just regular organizing stuff or entrepreneurial stuff, I'll just put out a post asking for people who can talk about that. And then I have a guest form or guest application for them to fill out that I include in the post. And they fill that out. I go through it, I read through it, and I decide from there who I would like to extend an invitation to for a guest. That's one of the ways that I find guests. Another way is in those same groups, if I see someone who's looking to be a guest and the topics that they can speak on are of interest to me and I feel like it'll be good for my show, I'll reach out to them and say, hey, I'm Angel from the Monaco podcast. I saw your post. I would love to have you as a guest on my show. Let's chat. And also, I find guests from referrals and pitches. Other podcast hosts will give me recommendations for guests, or I may hear someone on one of my podcast hosts' friends' shows, and I'll reach out to them and say, hey, you had a really great guest on your show. I would love to have that person on my show. Do you mind connecting us? So we do that. Recently, I have been getting a lot of pitches through emails with people wanting to be on the show. So those are the ways that I find guests for the show. Question 6. What equipment do you use? Is it expensive? To record, I use a microphone that I got off of Amazon for about $30. A friend of mine, when I first started recording, she had a podcast. So I asked her if I could borrow her podcast to record. And she let me borrow her. I asked her. I asked her if I could borrow her podcast to record. I asked her if I could borrow her mic to record. And she told me yes, and told me that if I liked it, she had got it off Amazon and told me that it wasn't very expensive. So I said, okay, cool. And she also said, she's like, a lot of times I don't even use the mic. Sometimes I just record from my phone, or I'll just turn my computer on and I'll just record from there. And you all know that I have recorded in my car. Obviously, I didn't have a microphone there. I do usually try to use my microphone when I am recording with a guest. Sometimes, if I'm recording by myself, I honestly don't feel like reaching the, I don't know, foot across my desk to grab the mic and plug it in, or sometimes I'll just do it while sitting on the couch. But $30 mic off of Amazon. And I use Spotify. Well, I used to use Spotify to edit because that was free, but they recently changed some things around, so you can't edit on there anymore. So now I use Riverside for my editing, but I'm also able to occasionally outsource my editing when the funds allow for it. So I do that as well. So the equipment to get started was not very expensive, $30 for a mic, and that was it. Question number 7: how do you make money from podcasting? So actually, I think this is the question that I get asked the most. I think I said one of the other questions was one that I get asked frequently, but it's actually, how do you make money from podcasting? And there are several ways that you can make money from podcasting, but they are definitely not easy. The most common way that most people know of is from advertisement and sponsorships. But you can't just say, "Oh, I have a podcast," and all these sponsors start running towards you, because in order to get ads and sponsorships, you have to meet requirements for the amount of downloads that you get per episode, how many episodes you've had, how many followers you have, how many subscribers you have, how many new people are constantly listening to your podcast and that you're reaching. So, for example, on Spotify, in order for you to sign up for listener support, and listener support is just where your listeners can give you a monthly donation, but they want you to have 100 active listeners. I think it's like every 30 days or something like that, in order for you to be able to set that up. And businesses, of course, they want to ensure that they're getting a return on their investment with these ads and sponsorships, because for like big name podcasts, I mean, people can pay thousands of dollars for an ad. And so they want to make sure that, they're going to get something back on this. So they're looking for shows that have tens of thousands of downloads per episode, not just for your show, but each episode they want tens of thousands of downloads for that episode, because that they know that they're getting a good reach and the chances of someone purchasing their product are higher. On my show, when you hear ads or sponsorships, it is from either my business, or it's from another small business that I know, or from a podcast that I've been on the show, or the host has been on my show and we're doing a promo swap, or either from tools or resources that I'm affiliated with. So I talk about that on my show. Another thing that is popular for podcasts making money is a Patreon, or a Patreon or a subscription, or the buy me a coffee like I have, but I will explain those a little bit more later. The next question is, do you run out of episode ideas? And the answer is yes and no. Sometimes I will draw a blank about what I want to talk about, or I'll go back and look at something that I've written out, or something I've already recorded, and I just decide that I don't want to put it out right then, or I don't like it. I may want to combine something. And I have this idea, but I don't necessarily want to put it out. But I will say that my best episode ideas usually come at midnight when I should be asleep. That's actually when I got the idea to do this episode, to make the 100th episode about questions. It was somewhere between midnight and 2 a.m. I honestly don't know when. I couldn't fall asleep. It just popped in my head. I was like, oh, okay. And all these questions that people usually ask me about the podcast like started flooding my head. And I was like, all right, hopefully I remember all these when I wake up in the morning. I couldn't sleep. Said, well, I might as well just start writing the questions now, writing down the questions now and writing the answers to them. So that's what I did. I don't necessarily run out of ideas. I just may not always want to talk about the idea that I already have written out. Question number 9. Do you read off a script? Again, yes and no. I do like to write out my thoughts because if not, I will forget them. There have been some episodes where I've just kind of not necessarily gone off script, but didn't have a script. And I forgot points that I wanted to talk about. So, fun fact here, when I was in college, I've told y'all before, I was a communications major, and as a communications major, you had to take a public speaking class, and I also took advanced speech writing. I never actually fully wrote out my speeches. I would just do the drafts of them or the highlights because you had to turn that in to the professor. They didn't want everything that you were going to say in the speech because it was supposed to come off as being natural and not rehearsed. Also, I was lazy and I did not want to write out the whole speech. So I would just do like my highlighted bullet points, and I would make little notes about things that I wanted to say at each point, and the rest of it was just kind of whatever popped in my head or whatever went with the flow. And that is what I do with my podcast recording. I put down my main thoughts for it, and I make little notes out to the side about things that I want to hit on. And so usually when I'm recording, that will help to trigger what it is that I want to talk about. Okay. So now here we are at the question more about Patreon. So people have also asked me why I don't have a Patreon. So for those of you that don't know what Patreon is a space for creators to share exclusive content with their audience. It's a monthly paid subscription that allows for the listeners to be able to receive perks and bonuses for paying for it. So it may be an ad-free episode, or it may be getting the episode early, or you get exclusive swag or merch that you only get as being a Patreon. Some other benefits that I've seen of being a Patreon are a meet and greet with the host, or a quarterly hour-long chat with the host, or being able to suggest episode ideas. And there are different tiers for the Patreon that can range anywhere from $1 to $1,000. There are actually some that are like $10,000 or $50,000. I do think most of those are a joke. I don't know anyone that's paying $50,000 for exclusiveness to a podcast. I mean, if you are, please give me that $50,000. I will create a Patreon just for that, or you can drop it in my Buy Me a Coffee fund. But yeah, so the reason that I don't have a Patreon is because I don't really run a lot of ads or promos on my show. Whenever I do, it's usually just something quick at the beginning. But if you're really into podcasts and you listen to big name podcasts, small name podcasts, you know that the bigger name podcasts, sometimes you can be listening to an episode and literally every 2 to 3 minutes, you're getting an ad or a promo or something like that. And so that's what the Patreon is for, is to cut out you having to hear that ad and interrupting the show. You can just go straight through it. And then another reason is I'm honestly not sure what type of swag I would offer or that I should even offer. And then there's just there's a bunch of other factors that go into it as well. But there's Patreon that I talked about that. That's one way to make money. Then there's also Apple Podcast subscriptions. It's similar to Patreon where you can like get the episode early, or you can get it ad free, or however it is that they decide to set it up. Or also on Patreon, I don't know if they do this on Apple Podcasts, but I know also on Patreon, some people release certain episodes only on there. So that's it. If you don't pay the fee to get in there, you don't get the episodes. They'll talk about the Patreon episodes on their regular show, on the free show, and that's a way for them to try to entice you to get the Patreon because they'll give you the details of it and you'll think, ooh, this sounds really interesting. I really want to hear this case. And you're like, should I pay the money for it or not? So, but yeah, Patreon, Apple subscription. I think Spotify maybe has a subscription that you can sign up for other than just the listener support. I'm not quite sure, but I do Buy Me a Coffee. And on Buy Me a Coffee, they too have a membership that you can create for people to sign up for. But again, I don't know like what type of swag that I would offer, or then the thought of having to create a whole nother separate episode that's not available, that just makes my head spin, guys. So yeah, I like Buy Me a Coffee, and I like not having the membership thing as well. One of the reasons that I really like Buy Me a Coffee is because it's just when you want to, you can go in there and you can give the amount that you want to give, however much you want to give, versus having a set membership for whatever amount it is, and then every month it's just coming out. So I like Buy Me a Coffee. Those are the burning questions that I usually get about podcasting and how does it work. I love behind the scenes stuff. I am sure that some other people out there love it as well and like to know what's going on behind the scenes. So I thought this would just be a really cool thing to do. So let me know if you would like more Q&A type of episodes to answer any burning questions that you have. I would be happy to do another one, whether it's about organization, entrepreneurship, public relations, podcasting, just hit me up and let me know. Thank you all so much for helping me to reach 100 episodes, and I can't wait for the next 100. All right, I'll talk to y'all again soon. Bye. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Modco Podcast. I hope that you enjoyed this episode and learned something from it. Be sure to share this episode with a friend, family member, colleague, or anyone you think will enjoy it. Make sure you hit the follow or subscribe button. And if you love the podcast, please leave us a 5-star rating and review on your favorite podcasting app. That helps others to find us and gets us listed in other show recommendations. So you all know that I run on coffee, and so does the show. If you'd like to buy us a coffee, you can do so by clicking on the link in the show notes. Thank you so much, and chat soon.